James was a renowned artist, a man once hailed as a genius, whose bold and unconventional works had redefined modern art. But behind the fame, James was a broken man. A decade earlier, his life was shattered when his young daughter, Emily, disappeared without a trace. Ever since that fateful day, every canvas he touched seemed to echo her absence, a haunting void he couldn't fill. James' mansion, hidden deep in the woods near a small town in upstate New York, reflected his solitude. The sprawling property, surrounded by towering oaks and overgrown gardens, stood as a silent witness to his grief. The once vibrant and inviting home had become a fortress of memories, with each room filled with faded photographs, abandoned toys, and unfinished paintings, all serving as constant reminders of the life he had lost. He rarely ventured beyond its iron gates, isolating himself from the world he once dominated. Lately, however, James' creativity had dried up entirely. The bold strokes that once flowed freely now seemed forced, his canvases remaining blank for days on end. The frustration of his creative block gnawed at him, further deepening his despair. He would spend hours staring at old photographs of Emily, desperately trying to grasp some inspiration, but all he found was emptiness. It was as if his art had died along with the hope of ever seeing his daughter again. One rainy afternoon, James sat in his dimly lit studio, a bottle of whiskey at his side, gazing at an unfinished portrait of Emily. He leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling as he whispered, "I can't do this anymore." He needed a change, something or someone, to break the suffocating cycle. It was then that he stumbled upon Mariah's portfolio, a collection of raw but promising artworks from a young artist seeking mentorship. Mariah, an enigmatic 20-something, appeared at his doorstep 2 weeks later. Her arrival was almost surreal. She seemed too young, too fragile to be a part of James' dark and oppressive world. She had a guarded demeanor, her eyes carrying secrets she had no intention of sharing. Despite her unpolished skills, there was an unmistakable spark in her art, a blend of innocence and untamed passion that intrigued James. And yet, it was her necklace that struck him the most. A small, silver locket dangled from her neck, its design eerily familiar. James' eyes lingered on it, his voice low and rough. "Where did you get that?" he asked suddenly, breaking the awkward silence that had settled between them. Mariah hesitated, her fingers instinctively reaching for the locket. I don't really know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I've had it for as long as I can remember." The words unsettled James. That locket was identical to the one Emily wore the day she disappeared. He tried to dismiss it as mere coincidence, but the possibility gnawed at him, sparking an unsettling curiosity. Was Mariah connected to Emily in some way? Or was this just a cruel trick of fate? Days passed, and Mariah settled into her new role. She painted in a corner of the expansive studio, often stealing glances at James, who remained distant and brooding. But James couldn't stay distant for long. His curiosity about her past, her story, and especially that locket soon turned into an obsession. He found himself studying her every movement, her mannerisms, searching for some clue, some connection to Emily. Mariah, too, was drawn to James, though in a different way. There was a darkness in him that mirrored her own, a pain she couldn't quite understand but felt compelled to explore. She shared fragments of her own troubled childhood, tales of foster homes and forgotten birthdays, but her memories were often hazy, as if a part of her life had been erased. One night, as they sat by the fireplace, James broke the silence. "Mariah, do you remember anything about your parents?" he asked, his eyes intense. Mariah shook her head, her voice heavy with sadness. "No, just flashes. A woman's voice, the smell of lilacs, and sometimes a distant scream." She paused, then added, "It's like parts of me are missing." The words struck James deeply, fueling his growing suspicion. Could Mariah be Emily? Or was he losing himself to a desperate fantasy? Driven by the need for answers, he began to dig deeper, pressing Mariah for details, probing her memories with increasing intensity. "I need to know, Mariah," he insisted one evening, his voice filled with urgency. "That locket, it belonged to my daughter. She was wearing it the day she disappeared. Mariah stared at him, her face pale and conflicted. "Are you saying I might be her?" she asked, her voice a mix of hope and disbelief. But James had no answer, only more questions. Mariah felt a storm of emotions swelling inside her. The possibility that she could be James' lost daughter was both terrifying and oddly comforting. For years, she had wandered through life feeling incomplete, haunted by fragmented memories that never made sense. And now, this stranger in a decaying mansion claimed she might be someone else, someone who had been loved and missed deeply. But there was no immediate warmth between them. If anything, the air felt colder. Mariah sensed the desperation in James' gaze, a man clinging to hope, or perhaps to madness. She often caught him staring at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and suspicion. She wasn't sure if he saw Emily in her, or if he was merely trying to force her into that role. Days turned into weeks, and Mariah's presence in the mansion began to alter its atmosphere. It was subtle at first. Fresh flowers appearing on the kitchen table, windows thrown open to let in light and fresh air. Even James' behavior shifted, though not entirely for the better. He grew more obsessed, his demeanor oscillating between tender and tense, as if walking a tightrope between hope and fear. One evening, James decided to teach Mariah a specific painting technique he had once taught Emily. As they stood side by side in the vast studio, the sound of rain pattering against the windows, there was an unspoken heaviness between them. James guided Mariah's hand with his, correcting her strokes gently. The sensation was both familiar and unsettling for him. "You know," he began, his voice low and distant, "Emily used to get frustrated when she couldn't get it right the first time. She had a stubborn streak." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "Just like you." Mariah's hand froze, the paintbrush slipping from her grasp. The comparison felt invasive, as if James was trying to mold her into the person he had lost, whether she was Emily or not. "I'm not her," she blurted out, her voice tinged with both guilt and defiance. "I'm not Emily." James looked at her, his face a mixture of pain and anger. "But you could be," he whispered. "If not by blood, then maybe by fate." Later that night, Mariah retreated to her small room on the third floor. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying James' words over and over. Could he be right? She didn't want to be an imposter, but she also couldn't shake the sense that James' search for Emily was somehow entwined with her own search for identity. The next morning, James was unusually quiet. He seemed withdrawn, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Mariah tried to keep her distance, unsure of how to navigate the growing tension between them. But then, she noticed something strange. A photograph had appeared on the mantelpiece in the living room. It was an old, faded picture of a young girl wearing the same locket Mariah had around her neck. Unable to resist, Mariah picked up the photograph and examined it closely. The girl's face was a blur, the details worn away by time, but the locket was unmistakable. The same intricate design, the same worn edges. Mariah felt a sudden, dizzying wave of recognition, as if she was looking into a mirror from another lifetime. "Where did you find this?" she asked, holding up the photograph when James walked into the room. He stared at it for a long moment, his jaw clenched. "It was Emily's," he said, his voice hoarse. "I found it among her things." Years after she disappeared, Mariah's hands trembled, the photograph slipping from her grip. "Why didn't you show me this before?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Because I wasn't sure if I wanted to," James admitted. "I've been afraid, Mariah. Afraid of hoping too much. Afraid of the possibility that you might be her, or that you might not." The admission hung in the air, raw and heavy. Mariah felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, confusion, and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, the need to belong. As days passed, the bond between James and Mariah deepened. Despite the tension, there were genuine moments of connection. James began to open up about his past, sharing memories of Emily that were both beautiful and heartbreaking. He described her laughter, the way she loved to dance in the rain, and how she once painted the walls of the mansion with bright, wild colors. Mariah listened intently, absorbing every detail as if trying to reconstruct a lost world. One afternoon, James suggested they take a break from painting. He led Mariah to a small, dusty attic filled with old boxes. "Emily's things are here," he said quietly. "I've never had the courage to go through them, until now." The attic was cluttered with toys, clothes, and unfinished sketches. Mariah's eyes were drawn to a small, worn teddy bear sitting on top of a box. She reached out and touched it gently, a memory stirring in the back of her mind. Something about a teddy bear from her own childhood, but the details were fuzzy. James watched her closely. "Do you remember anything?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mariah shook her head, frustrated. "I don't know. I feel something, but it's like trying to remember a dream." Then, James found a diary. It was Emily's, filled with childish handwriting, doodles, and the occasional painting. He handed it to Mariah, his hands shaking. "Maybe this will help," he said, his eyes full of hope. As Mariah flipped through the pages, she found a drawing that sent chills down her spine. It was a sketch of the silver locket, carefully detailed and unmistakably identical to the one she wore. Next to the drawing was a single line in Emily's handwriting. "This will always bring me back home." Tears filled Mariah's eyes as she read the words. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Could she really be Emily? Could this locket be the missing link between her fragmented past and James' relentless search for his daughter? But before she could process it further, James asked a question that changed everything. "Mariah, if you're not my daughter, then why do you have her locket?" Mariah's eyes were wide with confusion. I don't know," she stammered, "but I want to find out." The realization hit them both at the same time. The truth was still out there, buried beneath years of pain and mystery, and neither of them could turn back now. With the discovery of Emily's diary, the search for the truth took a new, more desperate turn. James and Mariah were no longer just artist and muse, but two fractured souls driven by the same haunting question. Who was Mariah, really? And how did she come to possess Emily's locket? The unease between them grew as they began their investigation. The mansion's isolation had always felt suffocating, but now it felt alive with secrets. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if every creaking floorboard, every shadow in the corners, whispered of untold stories. One evening, James and Mariah sat at the massive wooden dining table, papers and photographs spread out between them. They had been piecing together whatever fragments of information they could find about Emily's disappearance. Mariah's expression was a mixture of determination and weariness. "We need to find out where I came from," she said bluntly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. James nodded, his eyes fixed on a crumpled newspaper clipping from years ago. It was an article about Emily's disappearance, featuring a grainy photo of a younger James standing in front of the mansion, his face lined with anguish. "There were never any solid leads," he murmured. "It was as if she vanished into thin air. But you being here, it changes everything." Mariah didn't respond immediately, her mind already racing. "I don't know why, but I feel like I've been here before," she said finally, her voice distant. "Not this house, but this feeling of searching, of not knowing who I really am." James leaned forward, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and desperation. "Then let's not stop. Let's find every piece of the puzzle, no matter how painful." The next day, they decided to visit the town's archives. It was a small, dusty building, its faded sign barely legible. The interior was equally unimpressive, filled with old filing cabinets and yellowing newspapers. James hadn't been there in years, not since the first frantic weeks after Emily's disappearance. He remembered the looks of pity from the townspeople, the whispers of theories that ranged from kidnappings to a runaway daughter. Inside the archives, Mariah felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if the dusty smell of old paper held faint traces of her past. They approached the gray-haired archivist, who regarded them with mild curiosity. "What can I help you with?" he asked, his voice gravelly. James cleared his throat. "We're looking for records related to a missing person case from over a decade ago. Emily Harrison, my daughter," he added, his voice breaking slightly at the last word. The archivist's expression softened. I remember that case, he said slowly. It was a tragedy. No one thought it would end the way it did. Or rather, didn't end at all. He led them to a dusty back room filled with boxes labeled by year. As the archivist shuffled through the files, James' hands trembled with both anticipation and dread. Mariah watched him closely, sensing how deeply the memories were affecting him. When the man finally found the box marked Emily Harrison, 2013, he placed it carefully on a nearby table. As Mariah opened the box, the smell of aged paper hit her, bringing with it a rush of anxiety. Inside were police reports, witness statements, and photographs from the investigation. James stared at the contents, his face a mask of pain and resolve. "These are the same documents I looked at years ago," he said quietly, "but maybe we missed something." Mariah picked up a report and started reading. It was a list of suspects that had been questioned but eventually cleared. One name, however, stood out to her: Eleanor Mayfield. She had been listed as a person of interest, but the notes beside her name indicated that she was never found for further questioning. "Who is Eleanor Mayfield?" Mariah asked, holding up the paper. James frowned, trying to recall the name. She was a woman who lived on the outskirts of town. She had some strange reputation. People said she was reclusive, maybe unstable. I never got to speak to her directly, but the police told me she vanished around the same time as Emily. Mariah felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think she could be connected to my past?" James hesitated, the possibility dawning on him slowly. "It's possible. If she had something to do with Emily's disappearance, then maybe she had something to do with you, too." The discovery of Eleanor Mayfield's name set a new urgency in motion. They returned to the mansion, and James immediately began searching for any trace of Eleanor in his own notes. He found an old address and a few scattered newspaper clippings describing her as a troubled artist who had been known for her eccentric behavior. Mariah's curiosity was piqued. "We need to find her," she said firmly. James nodded. "But she could be anywhere. She's been missing for as long as Emily has." Despite the doubts, they set out the next morning. The old address was in a remote part of town, where dilapidated houses stood amid overgrown weeds. It was a bleak, unsettling area, and Mariah felt a knot of anxiety growing in her stomach. When they reached the address, they found an abandoned house, its windows shattered and front door hanging crookedly. It seemed empty, like the last echoes of a ghost's whisper. But something caught Mariah's eye: a small, rusted metal box buried under debris near the porch. She knelt down, her heart pounding, and pried it open. Inside was a collection of old photographs, letters, and what appeared to be a diary. Her hands shook as she pulled out a photograph of a little girl standing next to Eleanor, both of them smiling. The girl was wearing the same silver locket that Mariah had around her neck. James, who had been searching nearby, saw the photograph and hurried over. "What is it?" he asked urgently. Mariah handed him the picture, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's me, isn't it?" James stared at the photo, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. "It's you," he confirmed, his voice choked. "But that means Eleanor Mayfield was with you, and Emily." The weight of the revelation hit them both. Eleanor Mayfield wasn't just a missing person. She was a key piece of both Mariah's and Emily's stories. The diary inside the box, however, was mostly illegible, the ink smudged by time and moisture. But one entry was still clear enough to read: "The girl is safe for now. She will remember when the time is right." Mariah's eyes filled with tears. "What does that mean? Was I kept here? Hidden all these years?" James' face was pale, his expression a mixture of relief and torment. "It means we're closer to the truth, Mariah, but it also means there's more to uncover." They left the abandoned house with more questions than answers, but with a renewed sense of purpose. As they drove back to the mansion, Mariah looked at James. "I want to know everything, no matter how painful." James nodded solemnly. "We'll find the answers, Mariah. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find Emily too." Back at the mansion, James and Mariah found themselves at a crossroads. The discovery of the photograph with Eleanor and Mariah had answered one question, but opened a dozen more. James couldn't shake the image of the little girl's smile. It was hauntingly familiar, yet unsettlingly different from what he remembered of Emily. Meanwhile, Mariah's mind was racing, her emotions tangled in a mix of hope and fear. That night, James and Mariah sat in the dimly lit living room, the fireplace crackling softly. It was a rare moment of quiet between them, but the silence was far from peaceful. James stared at the photograph they had found, his fingers tracing the outline of Mariah's face in the picture. He finally broke the silence. If Eleanor really had you, then she must have known something about Emily, too. I wonder, was she trying to protect you? Or was it something else? Mariah shuddered at the thought. It's hard to believe that someone would keep a child hidden for so long. Unless there was something terrible to hide, she said quietly. Her eyes met James. But what if I was never supposed to be found? James' expression hardened. No, he said firmly. You were meant to be found. I don't care how long it takes or what we uncover. We'll find out who you really are, Mariah. And maybe we'll find Emily along the way. The next morning, Mariah awoke to find James already up, poring over old documents and photographs in the study. His obsession was palpable, the weight of it visible in his tired eyes and unshaven face. Mariah, still shaken by the revelations of the previous day, approached cautiously. You've been up all night, haven't you? She asked, concern evident in her voice. James looked up, startled. I couldn't sleep, he admitted. There's too much to process. I keep going over the same details, hoping to find something new. Mariah sat down beside him. We need to be smarter about this, she suggested. Eleanor Mayfield was the last person seen with me, or at least with the version of me that was in that photo. We should try to trace her steps. Maybe there are still people in town who remember her. The idea made sense, and it gave James a sense of direction. That afternoon, they drove back to the town, this time to speak with locals who might remember Eleanor. They started with a small diner that had been there for decades, a place where stories lingered as long as the stale coffee smell. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Carla, looked skeptical when James asked about Eleanor. You mean that old artist lady? She asked, her tone cautious. She was always a bit of a mystery. Lived out by herself, kept to herself. Mariah leaned forward, her voice urgent. Do you know if she had any children with her? Or maybe a little girl? Carla paused, her brow furrowed. There was talk of a kid, but nobody ever saw her. Some folks thought she was just making it up, for sympathy. But there were others who swore they heard a child's voice coming from her house at night. James and Mariah exchanged a glance. It was a small piece of the puzzle, but it was something. The next stop was the town's library, where they hoped to find more records about Eleanor's past. The librarian, an older man with thinning hair, seemed intrigued by their inquiry. Eleanor Mayfield? He repeated. Now, that's a name I haven't heard in years. She was quite the recluse, but she had a talent for painting. Some of her work was even displayed here, briefly. Mariah's interest was piqued. Do you still have any of her paintings? She asked. The librarian led them to a dusty storeroom in the back, where old artworks were stored. There, amid stacks of faded canvases, they found 2 paintings signed by Eleanor. One depicted a little girl standing near a forest, her back turned to the viewer, wearing the same locket that Mariah had. The other painting showed a woman, presumably Eleanor, holding the child's hand protectively. Mariah's heart raced as she studied the paintings. It's me. It has to be, she whispered. James nodded slowly, his voice filled with awe and uncertainty. It looks like Eleanor was trying to preserve something, some truth that only she knew. As they examined the paintings more closely, Mariah noticed a set of coordinates scribbled in the corner of one canvas, barely visible beneath the layers of paint. James, look, she said, pointing to the faint numbers. These are coordinates. Maybe it's a location, a place she wanted someone to find. James quickly wrote down the coordinates. This could be it, he said, his eyes blazing with new determination. If these lead to where she was keeping you, it could be the key to understanding everything. The coordinates led them deep into the woods outside town, far from the abandoned house where they had found the rusted box. The air was cold, the dense forest filled with an eerie silence. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, as if secrets had been left here to rot in the undergrowth. After nearly an hour of navigating through overgrown paths and uneven terrain, they arrived at a small clearing. In the center stood an old, decrepit cabin, its wooden boards weathered and roof sagging. Mariah felt a strange pull toward the structure, a sense of familiarity that she couldn't explain. "This must be it," James whispered, his voice low. "This is where Eleanor brought you." Mariah hesitated at the threshold, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. When she finally pushed it open, the inside was dark and musty, filled with broken furniture and scattered remnants of a past life. As they moved through the cabin, Mariah spotted a small cot in the corner, covered in dusty blankets. Next to it was a wooden chest, half open, with old toys inside. One toy caught her eye, a small, tattered doll with one button eye missing. Mariah picked it up slowly, a distant memory surfacing. "I remember this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I think I used to hold this doll every night." James watched her closely, his own emotions raw. "This was your room," he said quietly. "This is where you lived." But before they could absorb the magnitude of the discovery, Mariah noticed something on the wall, a series of childlike drawings, made with crayons. They depicted a little girl and a woman, both holding hands under a bright sun. Mariah touched the drawings gently, tears welling up in her eyes. "This was my life," she said softly. "I was happy here, but I don't understand why." James stepped closer, his voice barely audible. "Maybe Eleanor was protecting you, Mariah. Maybe she knew something terrible was coming, and she did what she thought was best." Suddenly, a noise outside broke the silence. It was faint, but it sounded like footsteps approaching. James and Mariah exchanged a look, their bodies tensing. "Did you hear that?" Mariah whispered, her voice filled with fear. James nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for a heavy metal rod lying nearby. "Stay behind me," he instructed quietly. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a shadow appeared at the window. James braced himself, but Mariah's voice broke through the tension. "Wait," she said, her eyes widening. "It's a woman, an old woman." The door creaked open slowly, revealing a frail figure wrapped in a dark cloak. The woman's face was lined with age, her eyes sharp and wary. She looked at Mariah, then at James, her voice raspy but clear. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her gaze fixed on Mariah. "I knew you'd come back." The old woman's words hung in the air, heavy with mystery. Mariah and James stood frozen in the dim light of the cabin, struggling to process the unexpected encounter. The woman's face was deeply lined, her eyes dark but sharp, like someone who had seen too much and forgotten too little. Her clothes were worn, her movements slow, yet there was a commanding presence about her. James was the first to break the silence, his voice rough and demanding. "Who are you?" he asked, stepping forward, his grip tightening around the metal rod he still held. The woman's eyes shifted to him, studying his face with an eerie calmness. "I'm Eleanor," she replied simply. "And I suppose you're James Harrison, Emily's father." James' expression hardened at the mention of Emily. "You know who I am," he said coldly. "Then you also know why we're here." Eleanor's gaze drifted back to Mariah. "Yes," she said softly, "I know exactly why you're here. But it's not just Emily you're searching for, is it?" Mariah's heart raced. There was a strange familiarity in Eleanor's voice, a tone that felt oddly comforting despite the circumstances. "Why did you take me?" she asked bluntly, her voice breaking. "What happened to me? To Emily?" Eleanor's eyes softened, a hint of regret flashing across her face. "I never meant to hurt you," she said slowly. "I did what I thought was right. What was necessary." The ambiguity of her response made James' anger flare. "Necessary?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You took my daughter. You hid Mariah. How could any of this be necessary?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "You don't understand," she replied calmly. "I took them to protect them. From people you couldn't see, James. People who would have destroyed them both." The weight of her words struck Mariah like a punch. Her mind raced back to the flashes of her childhood. The dark corridors, the feeling of being watched, the sense of constant danger. It all began to make a twisted kind of sense. "Who were you protecting us from?" she demanded, her voice sharp with urgency. Eleanor's expression grew darker, haunted by memories she had buried long ago. "There was a group," she began, her voice low and filled with bitterness. "They trafficked children, using art galleries and auctions as covers. I was one of them once, but when I learned the truth, I couldn't stay. I couldn't let them have you or Emily." The revelation was staggering. Mariah's knees felt weak, and she had to lean against the wall to steady herself. "You were part of this?" she asked, disbelief and betrayal evident in her tone. "Yes," Eleanor admitted, her eyes brimming with shame. "But I left it all behind when I found out about you too. I couldn't let them take you." James, however, was not ready to accept Eleanor's justification. "If you wanted to protect them," he said bitterly, "you should have come to me. You should have told the authorities." Eleanor shook her head, her voice filled with sorrow. "I tried, but the network was too powerful. They had connections everywhere, even within law enforcement. I knew that if I spoke up, both you and the girls would be in even greater danger." Mariah's anger simmered beneath the surface, but a part of her began to understand the twisted logic of Eleanor's choices. "So you kept us hidden," she said slowly. "But why take Emily? Why take me?" Eleanor's voice trembled as she answered. "I took you both because I saw no other way. Emily was taken by the group first, and when I found you, Mariah, I knew they would come for you too. I thought if I could hide you here, in this remote place, you might be safe." James' voice was filled with disbelief. "But you failed, Eleanor. You failed me, and you failed them." The old woman nodded slowly, her face etched with guilt. "I know," she admitted, "but I had to try. I couldn't let the darkness win." There was a long, painful silence, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. Mariah felt a surge of anger mixed with a strange, confusing gratitude. Eleanor's actions had caused her years of suffering, but they had also kept her alive. "What happened to Emily?" James asked, his voice barely audible. It was the question that had haunted him for over a decade, and now it was directed at the one person who might hold the answer. Eleanor's face contorted with pain. "Emily was taken from me," she said, her voice cracking. "I tried to keep her hidden, just like I did with Mariah. But they found us one night. I managed to escape with Mariah. But, Emily, I never saw her again." The words struck James like a physical blow. He stumbled back, tears welling up in his eyes. Mariah reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with a raw, genuine sorrow. "I failed you, James. I failed Emily. But I didn't want to fail Mariah, too." Mariah's mind was spinning, her emotions torn between anger and pity. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "What do we do now that we know the truth?" Eleanor looked at her with a strange, almost hopeful expression. "There is one last thing," she said quietly. "A man named Victor. He was one of the leaders of the group, the one who orchestrated everything. He's still out there, still searching. If you truly want answers, you'll have to find him." James' face darkened. "And where can we find this Victor?" Eleanor hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "He operates out of a gallery in the city under the name Art Haven. It's a front, a place where children like Emily are still trafficked." The words ignited a new fire in James' eyes. "Then that's where we're going," he declared, his voice filled with a dangerous resolve. Mariah looked at Eleanor one last time, searching for something, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps understanding. "Why are you helping us now?" she asked. Eleanor's voice was frail, but filled with a desperate honesty. "Because I want to end it," she said. "I want to make things right, even if it's too late for Emily." James and Mariah exchanged a look, their decision clear. It was time to leave the past behind and face the darkness head-on. As they turned to leave, Eleanor called after them, her voice echoing in the empty cabin. "Be careful," she warned. "Victor is dangerous, and he knows how to use people's pain against them." James nodded grimly. "We're not afraid of the truth anymore." As they made their way back to the car, Mariah glanced back at the cabin one last time. It was a place of broken dreams and dark memories, but it was also where the first real answers had been found. "Are you ready for this?" James asked her as they reached the car, his voice steady. Mariah's response was clear, her eyes filled with a new determination. "I have to be," she said, "for Emily, and for myself." The drive back to the city was silent, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them. The search for Victor would not be easy, but it was the only way forward. And this time, they were not alone. The car ride back to the city was long and heavy with anticipation. James and Mariah barely spoke, both lost in their thoughts. The streets became busier as they drew closer to the center, the sounds of urban life contrasting sharply with the silence of the woods they had left behind. The looming confrontation with Victor was no longer a distant possibility. It was now a concrete, dangerous reality. Art Haven stood in a nondescript part of the city, nestled between a dilapidated cafe and a run-down apartment building. The gallery's facade was plain, with large windows displaying abstract paintings. It seemed innocuous, almost mundane, but Mariah felt a chill as she stepped closer. There was an air of deception about the place, a hidden darkness behind the curated art. "Are you sure about this?" James asked, his voice low and wary. Mariah nodded. "I have to be," she replied. "This is the only way to get real answers." They stepped inside, finding themselves in a large room filled with various art pieces. The walls were painted white, with dim lighting that added a strange, eerie atmosphere. A few people milled about, admiring the works in silence. James and Mariah scanned the room cautiously, unsure of what to expect. A woman approached them, her smile polished and professional. "Welcome to Art Haven," she greeted warmly. "Is there a specific piece you're interested in, or would you like a tour?" James, attempting to play along, put on a facade of casual interest. "We're just browsing," he said, his eyes darting around. "But we heard there might be some exclusive pieces here. One's not on display." The woman's expression didn't change, but there was a brief, almost imperceptible flicker in her eyes. "Our exclusive pieces are available by appointment only," she explained, her voice smooth. "But I can certainly arrange something for you." Mariah stepped forward, her tone sharper than intended. "We need to see Victor," she stated plainly. The woman's demeanor changed instantly, her smile faltering. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name," she said, her voice tight. James leaned closer, his voice low and filled with menace. "Don't play games. We know he's here. Tell him James Harrison is looking for him." The woman's eyes widened slightly at the name, a clear sign that it meant something. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Wait here," she instructed before disappearing behind a heavy velvet curtain at the back of the room. Mariah's heart was pounding, her senses on high alert. She could feel James' tension beside her, his fists clenched tightly. Minutes later, the woman returned, her expression unreadable. "Follow me," she said curtly. They were led through a narrow hallway that twisted and turned, each step taking them deeper into the building. The air grew colder, the lighting dimmer, until they reached a dark, windowless room. In the center stood a man behind a large desk, his face partially obscured by shadows. Victor. He was older than James had imagined, with thinning hair and a face that spoke of both cunning and cruelty. His eyes were cold, assessing, as they settled on James and Mariah. "So," he began, his voice smooth and calculating, "the grieving father finally finds his way back to me." James' anger flared, but he kept his composure. "Where is Emily?" he demanded, his voice raw with desperation. Victor leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Straight to the point, I see," he said mockingly. "I should have expected that. But I'm afraid the answer isn't as simple as you'd like." Mariah stepped forward, her eyes burning with intensity. "We know what you did," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "We know you took children, used them for your twisted schemes." Victor's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing. "And you," he said slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle, "you must be Mariah, or perhaps Emily." "I could never quite tell." The words sent a jolt through Mariah. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "What happened to Emily?" Victor's smile widened. revealing a hint of sadistic pleasure. Emily was always a special child, he began. Bright, strong-willed, but she became a liability. I had plans for her, but she resisted too much. So, I had to let her go. James' composure broke at that moment. He slammed his fists on the desk, his voice filled with raw, unchecked emotion. You let her go? What does that mean? Is she dead? Victor remained calm, as if he had expected this reaction. No, he answered simply. She's not dead. At least, she wasn't when I last saw her. James felt a wave of dizzying relief mixed with rage. Where is she? Victor, he shouted. Tell me now. But Victor's expression remained indifferent, almost bored. Emily is beyond your reach, James, he said coldly. Even if I told you where she was, you wouldn't be able to get to her. Mariah's voice cut through the tension, sharp and filled with defiance. You don't get to decide that, she said. If you know where she is, you'll tell us. You owe us that much. Victor's eyes flickered with something resembling amusement. Oh, you? He repeated. I don't owe you anything. The world is a harsh place, Mariah, and it's not driven by debts or favors. It's driven by power. And right now, I hold the power. Mariah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. What about me? She asked, her voice softer but filled with a desperate need for answers. Why did you take me? Why did Eleanor try to protect me from you? Victor's face darkened at the mention of Eleanor. She betrayed us, he said bitterly. She was supposed to help us control you and Emily, but she turned against us, took you both and hid you away. Mariah's eyes blazed with anger. You tried to control us, she said. But why? What did you want from us? Victor leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. You and Emily were more than just children, Mariah. You were symbols of innocence, of art's true essence. Our buyers were willing to pay a fortune for children like you. The grotesque truth made Mariah's stomach turn. You're a monster, she whispered. Victor's gaze hardened. Call me what you like, he replied. But I did what I had to in a world that's crueler than you can imagine. James couldn't hold back any longer. He lunged forward, grabbing Victor by the collar. If you don't tell us where Emily is, I'll end you right here, he growled. But Victor only smirked, unfazed by the threat. You won't kill me, James, he said confidently, because I'm the only one who knows where she is. Mariah stepped forward, placing a hand on James' arm, her voice calm but firm. He's right, James, she said. We need him alive if we want to find Emily. James released Victor reluctantly, his chest heaving with fury. Then tell us, he demanded. Victor seemed to consider this for a moment, then finally spoke. There's a facility, far from here, where Emily was last taken. But it's heavily guarded, and getting there won't be easy. If you truly want to see her again, you'll need my help. Mariah felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. Why would you help us now? She asked, her voice filled with suspicion. Victor's eyes were cold and calculating. Because I have nothing left to lose, he said flatly. And perhaps, I want to see how this story ends. It was a dangerous alliance, but it was the only lead they had. Mariah and James exchanged a wary glance, understanding the stakes. Fine, James said finally. But know this, Victor. If you betray us, there won't be a second chance. Victor simply nodded, his smile returning. Then let's not waste any more time, he said. There's a long road ahead, and it's paved with secrets you're not ready for. Victor's information sent James and Mariah into a new chapter of their pursuit. He claimed that Emily had been taken to a remote facility on the outskirts of the city, a place hidden in plain sight. It was a name James had never heard before, the Haven Institute. Mariah and James didn't trust Victor, but they had no choice but to follow his lead. It was the closest they had come to finding Emily in over a decade. The drive was tense. Victor sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if this was a routine business trip rather than a rescue mission. His calm demeanor infuriated James, whose knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. Mariah sat beside James, silent and lost in thought. She could feel the enormity of what they were about to face. A fortress of secrets, pain, and perhaps the truth about Emily. After hours of driving, They finally reached a desolate industrial area, lined with abandoned warehouses. Victor pointed to a nondescript building with rusted metal doors. "That's it," he said. "But getting inside will be the real challenge." The building seemed abandoned, but Mariah felt a deep, unsettling sensation as she looked at it. "Is Emily really here?" she asked, her voice filled with both hope and doubt. Victor's response was cold. "She was, the last I heard. But you'll need to move quickly. The people who run this place don't take kindly to intruders." James parked the car a safe distance away, then turned to face Victor. "How do we get inside?" he demanded. Victor's eyes were steady. "There's a side entrance, usually guarded by 1 or 2 men. Once you're past that, you'll need to navigate a series of locked doors. The facility is built like a maze, deliberately confusing." Mariah felt a shiver run down her spine. Why would they make it so difficult? What are they hiding? Victor's gaze was unwavering. "They're hiding children like Emily. And you, Mariah." It was a harsh reminder of what was at stake. James reached into the back seat and pulled out a small handgun, checking the chamber before handing it to Mariah. "Just in case," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Mariah hesitated, then took the weapon with a determined nod. "I'm ready," she said. Victor led them toward the side entrance, moving with an eerie familiarity. The area was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of machinery in the distance. As they approached the entrance, 2 guards appeared, their faces blank but alert. Victor raised his hand, signaling for calm. "We're expected," he said smoothly, but James knew it was a lie. One of the guards frowned. "Who are you?" he asked, reaching for his radio. Without hesitation, James lunged forward, striking the guard in the jaw with brutal force. The other guard moved to draw his weapon, but Mariah was faster, hitting him with the butt of the handgun, knocking him unconscious. Victor glanced at them, mildly impressed. "Efficient," he remarked dryly. "Just get us inside," James snapped. They slipped through the side door and found themselves in a dimly lit corridor. The smell of disinfectant was overpowering, mixing with a faint, metallic odor. Mariah felt a wave of nausea, but pushed it aside. "Which way?" she whispered urgently. Victor led them down a series of narrow hallways, each one more labyrinthine than the last. The walls were lined with locked doors, some marked with codes, others with faded labels that hinted at sinister purposes. Observation room, isolation unit, medical wing. Mariah's anxiety grew with each step. The facility felt alive, like a living entity that had absorbed years of suffering and secrets. Finally, they reached a door labeled subject holding. Victor stopped and gestured to a keypad beside the door. "This is it," he said quietly, "but I don't have the code. You'll have to find another way in." James glared at him, his patience wearing thin. "How convenient," he muttered. Mariah stepped forward, examining the keypad. It was old, with worn-out numbers that hinted at frequent use. "We'll have to guess," she said, her voice tense. James tried a few combinations, but each failed attempt was met with a louder beeping sound. "This isn't working," he said, frustration evident in his voice. But Mariah's instincts were sharper. She noticed a small piece of paper taped to the wall nearby, partially hidden by dirt and grime. She tore it off and saw a faded set of numbers, 1128. "It's worth a try," she whispered, punching in the code. The door clicked open, and James and Mariah exchanged a brief look of relief. They pushed through, entering a large room lined with metal cages, each one containing a single bed. The room was cold, sterile, and filled with an eerie silence. Mariah's eyes scanned the rows of beds frantically, her heart pounding. "Emily!" she called out, her voice breaking. There was no response. James moved quickly, checking each bed, each small, empty cage. Desperation clawed at him. "Emily!" he shouted, his voice filled with both hope and terror. Suddenly, a faint voice emerged from one of the far corners. "Dad!" James froze, his entire body trembling. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto a small figure huddled in the back of a cage. It was Emily. She looked older, thinner, but her eyes, wide, fearful, yet still familiar, were unmistakable. "Emily!" James choked out, rushing to her side. He knelt down, tears streaming down his face. "It's me, sweetheart. It's Dad. I'm here." Emily reached through the bars, her small hands shaking as she touched James' face. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice raw and weak. Mariah stood a few feet away, tears welling up in her own eyes. The moment felt surreal, a reunion filled with joy but tainted by the horror of what Emily had endured. "We're going to get you out," she promised. Victor watched from the shadows, his face expressionless. "You found her," he said flatly. "But now comes the hard part." James, still holding Emily's hand, turned to face Victor. "What do you mean?" he demanded. Victor's voice was cold. "Getting her out of here is only the beginning. You've exposed yourselves, and the people who run this place won't let you leave easily." Mariah felt a surge of defiance. "We're not leaving without her," she said firmly. Victor shrugged. "Then you'll need to be ready for a fight," he warned. "There's an alarm system, and the guards will be here soon." James pulled Emily closer, his voice filled with determination. "I don't care what it takes," he said. "We're getting out of here, and we're taking Emily with us." The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, followed by the blaring of alarms. Mariah's grip on the handgun tightened, her eyes filled with resolve. "We're ready," she said. James looked at Mariah, then at Emily. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice filled with both fear and hope. As the guards burst into the room, James and Mariah stood their ground, ready to fight for the life they had found. A life worth saving, worth protecting, no matter the cost. The alarms blared through the facility, a piercing, mechanical sound that seemed to come from every direction. Red lights flashed urgently along the walls, casting eerie shadows across the sterile room. The urgency was palpable, but there was no time to waste. James, Mariah, and Emily stood huddled together in the center of the room, their eyes darting toward the only exit. "Stay behind me," James instructed, his voice steady but filled with raw fear. He picked up a metal rod he had found on the ground, gripping it tightly. "We're going to make it out of here." Mariah positioned herself between James and Emily, her gun raised, her body tense and ready. Emily, weak and scared, clung to Mariah's arm, her breathing rapid and shallow. "Are we going to be okay?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mariah glanced down at her, her expression softening for a moment. "Yes," she promised. "We're getting you out of here." Victor stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the door. "You've got a few minutes before they surround the place," he said, his tone matter of fact. "But once they do, it'll be nearly impossible to get through." James shot Victor a look of distrust. "Then you better make sure your information is right," he said coldly. "Because if it isn't..." Victor didn't flinch. "It's right," he assured. "But you need to move. Now." They moved quickly, James leading the way while Mariah stayed close to Emily. They made their way back down the dark hallways, retracing their steps with Victor guiding them from behind. The echoes of running footsteps were getting louder. The guards were closing in. At the first turn, they encountered a group of 3 guards rushing toward them. James reacted instantly, swinging the metal rod with brutal force. The first guard crumpled to the floor, but the second managed to block the blow, lunging at James. Mariah, with surprising precision, fired a shot that grazed the guard's shoulder, sending him stumbling back. "Keep moving," James shouted, his voice filled with urgency. They continued down the hallway, but it was clear the guards were more prepared now. Another set of footsteps approached rapidly from the opposite direction. Mariah quickly reloaded, her hands surprisingly steady despite the chaos around her. As the guards rounded the corner, she fired 2 shots, hitting one guard in the leg and forcing the others to retreat temporarily. Emily, her face pale, clung tightly to Mariah's side. "I'm scared," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know, sweetheart," Mariah said gently, "but you're strong. We're going to get out of here." James glanced back, his expression a mix of rage and desperation. "We're almost there," he assured Emily, trying to keep her spirits up despite the growing danger. Victor suddenly grabbed James' arm, pulling him toward a different corridor. "This way," he barked. "The main exit will be swarming with guards. There's a service door at the back, fewer eyes, James hesitated for a moment, then nodded. They followed Victor's lead, taking a sharp turn into a narrower passage. The walls felt closer here, the air stifling. Mariah could hear Emily's breathing grow more labored with each step, but they couldn't afford to slow down. Almost there, Victor muttered under his breath, glancing nervously over his shoulder. But as they approached the service door, they found two heavily armed guards waiting, their rifles raised. "Stop right there," one of them shouted. James and Mariah froze, their hearts pounding. Mariah raised her gun, her eyes cold and determined, while James stepped in front of Emily, shielding her with his body. "We're not stopping," James said firmly, his voice steady. The guards seemed taken aback by his defiance, but they didn't lower their weapons. "You're not going anywhere with her," the second guard warned.
"She belongs to us."
The words triggered something inside James. His anger erupted, and he lunged forward with a primal scream, swinging the metal rod at one of the guards. The impact was brutal, knocking the guard off balance. Mariah took advantage of the moment, firing a precise shot that hit the second guard in the chest. He fell back, his rifle clattering to the ground. "Go," James shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pushing forward. They burst through the service door, emerging into a dimly lit alley behind the building. The cold night air hit them like a slap, the sudden change almost overwhelming after the stifling confines of the facility. For a moment, they paused, catching their breath. Victor, who had kept pace with them, pointed toward a dark van parked nearby. "Get in," he urged. "We need to put distance between us and this place." Mariah's distrust was clear, but there was no time to argue. They piled into the van, with James behind the wheel. Victor slid into the passenger seat while Mariah and Emily huddled in the back. As James started the engine, Mariah turned to Victor, her voice filled with suspicion. "Why are you really helping us?" she demanded. Victor's eyes were unreadable. "Maybe I've grown tired of running," he said quietly. "Or maybe I want to see how this ends." James didn't wait for further explanations. He slammed his foot on the gas, the van lurching forward as they sped away from the facility. The roads were empty, save for the occasional streetlight casting brief patches of light into the darkness. Emily leaned against Mariah, exhausted but still alert. "Are we really safe now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mariah wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "We're safer than before," she said, her voice soft but certain. "But we're not done yet." As they drove through the night, James' thoughts were a chaotic mix of relief and lingering fear. Emily was back, but the reality of what she had endured weighed heavily on him. He glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes filled with a father's love and guilt. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he said, his voice breaking. "I never stopped looking for you." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but there was a small, fragile smile on her lips. "I knew you wouldn't give up," she said. "I knew you'd find me." The van sped down the empty highway, the city lights fading into the distance. It was far from over. Victor's presence was a constant reminder of the darkness that still loomed. Mariah's eyes were focused ahead, her mind already calculating their next steps. But for now, in the fleeting quiet of the night, there was a small sense of victory. They had found Emily, and even though the shadows of the past still lingered, there was a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. The van sped through the empty streets, cutting through the darkness like a silent predator. The reality of what had just transpired was still sinking in for James, Mariah, and Emily. The adrenaline of the escape had given way to a heavy, suffocating silence inside the vehicle. Emily leaned against Mariah, her small frame shivering despite the warmth of the blanket Mariah had wrapped around her. James kept his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was reeling. He had so many questions, but none seemed more urgent than the fear that lingered in the back of his mind. Would Emily ever truly be free from the trauma of the past decade? His jaw was clenched, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if trying to keep himself anchored to reality. Victor's voice broke the silence. "There's a safe house about an hour from here," he said, his tone surprisingly calm. "You can lay low there until you figure out your next move." James glanced at him sharply. "And what makes you think we'll trust you to lead us anywhere else?" Victor didn't flinch. Because you have no other choice, he replied coldly. You need a place where Emily can rest, where you can regroup. And believe it or not, I still have connections that can keep you hidden for a while. Mariah's distrust was evident, but her exhaustion was greater. Do you think they'll come after us? She asked, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Victor's expression was grim. Absolutely, he confirmed. They'll be searching the city by morning. You exposed one of their main facilities, and they won't let that go easily. James nodded slowly. Then take us to this safe house, he said reluctantly. But if this is another one of your games… Victor cut him off. It's not, he insisted. I don't have time for games anymore. The drive continued in silence. As they left the city limits, the roads became narrower and darker, flanked by dense woods. Mariah kept her arm around Emily, who had fallen into a fitful sleep. She looked so fragile, so much smaller than James remembered. He felt a wave of guilt, knowing that the girl who once ran through fields and laughed under the sun was now haunted by shadows he couldn't begin to understand. Dad, Emily murmured suddenly, her voice weak but clear. James's heart ached at the sound. It was the first time she had called him that in over a decade. Yes, sweetheart? He asked gently, his eyes softening as he glanced back at her through the mirror. Are we really safe now? She asked, her voice filled with a heartbreaking mixture of hope and doubt. James swallowed hard. We're safer than before, he said honestly. But I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you again.
I swear.
Emily nodded, but her eyes remained distant. I was afraid you forgot about me, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. James's chest tightened with emotion. Never, he said firmly. Not for a single day. The van continued down a dirt road, the trees growing thicker and closer, until they reached a small, secluded cabin. It was hidden among the dense pines, its windows dark and its exterior weathered, but it had the unmistakable air of a sanctuary. Victor stepped out first, his eyes scanning the area before motioning for James and Mariah to follow. This place is off the grid, Victor explained as they approached the cabin. No phone lines, no electricity, but it's stocked with food, water, and supplies. You'll be able to rest here for a few days before making your next move. Mariah's skepticism was clear. Why are you helping us now? She asked again, her voice harsher this time. What's in it for you? Victor met her gaze, his eyes tired but sincere. Redemption, he said simply, or something close to it. They stepped inside the cabin, finding it small but functional. The furniture was sparse, but there were blankets and a small stove in the corner. James gently laid Emily on the worn couch, covering her with another blanket. She closed her eyes almost immediately, her exhaustion finally overtaking her. James turned to Victor, his voice low and filled with suspicion. Is this really the end for you? Or are you planning something else? Victor leaned against the wall, his face shadowed by the dim light. I've seen enough, he admitted quietly. I was part of something monstrous, and I lost control of it a long time ago. But I won't run anymore. If helping you finish this is my way out, then so be it. James didn't respond immediately. He studied Victor's face, trying to read the man who had caused him so much pain. Do you know what they did to her? He asked suddenly, his voice raw. Victor's expression darkened. I know some of it, he said, but not all. They kept Emily isolated, away from the worst of it. But she saw things no child should ever see. Mariah's fists clenched at the thought. And now? She asked. What happens now? Victor's answer was blunt. Now you have a choice, he said. You can disappear, start over, or you can finish this. James looked at Mariah, then back at Victor. And how do we finish it? He asked, his voice filled with resolve. Victor paused, then spoke carefully. The network isn't just local, he explained. It's global. But the people who run it, the ones at the top, they're closer than you think. There's a main base of operations here, in this country. You cut the head off, the rest crumbles. Mariah's eyes narrowed. Where is this base? Victor hesitated. It's heavily guarded, he warned, and you'd be walking straight into their stronghold. But it's the only way to dismantle the network permanently. James took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "Then that's what we'll do," he said firmly. "We're not running anymore." The gravity of the words hung in the air, but they were not empty promises. This was their fight now, not just for Emily, but for every child still trapped in the shadows. Mariah felt a surge of determination, a fire that had been missing for so long. Emily stirred on the couch, her eyes fluttering open. "What's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice small but curious. James knelt beside her, his eyes filled with love. "We're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone else," he said gently. "And we're going to build a new life. For you. For all of us." Emily nodded slowly, a tiny spark of hope flickering in her eyes. "I want that," she whispered. "I want to be free." Mariah reached out, taking Emily's hand. "We will be," she promised. "We'll make sure of it." As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, James, Mariah, and Victor prepared for the next step. The battle was far from over, but the path was clear. They would face the darkness one last time, together, for Emily's future, and for the hope of a world that was better than the one they had left behind. The plan was simple in theory but treacherous in reality. James, Mariah, and Victor would infiltrate the network's main base, a heavily fortified mansion hidden in the outskirts of the city. It was here that the masterminds behind the trafficking ring operated, controlling everything from the shadows. It was the heart of the operation, the place where the nightmares had begun, and where they would end. The night was moonless as the three of them prepared for what could be their final confrontation. Inside the safe house, Emily watched silently, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew the risk they were taking, but she also understood that this was necessary. It was the only way to ensure that no other child would have to endure what she had. James knelt down beside Emily, his face lined with exhaustion but filled with a quiet resolve. "I need you to be strong, okay?" he said softly. "We'll be back soon. I promise." Emily nodded, her voice small but firm. "I know you will," she said. "Just be careful." Mariah leaned down, pulling Emily into a tight hug. "We're doing this for you," she whispered. "For you and for all the others." Victor, standing by the door, checked his weapon one last time. "It's time," he said, his voice low and steady. The drive to the mansion was tense, each of them lost in their own thoughts. For James, this was the culmination of years of searching and suffering. For Mariah, it was the chance to reclaim her identity, to find closure. For Victor, it was redemption, a way to atone for the darkness he had helped create. As they approached the mansion, they parked the car a distance away and proceeded on foot. The sprawling estate loomed before them, surrounded by high walls and surveillance cameras. The front gate was guarded, but Victor had anticipated this. He led them to a hidden side entrance, a narrow passage that bypassed the main security. Inside, the mansion was even more ominous than they had imagined. The hallways were lined with expensive art, a cruel irony considering the suffering that had taken place here. Mariah's grip on her weapon tightened as they moved deeper into the building, each step a reminder of what they were fighting for. They encountered the first set of guards in a dimly lit corridor. James acted swiftly, taking down one of them with a powerful strike, while Mariah fired a precise shot that incapacitated another. Victor moved with lethal efficiency, showing no hesitation as he cleared the path forward. "Keep moving," Victor urged. "The main control room is just ahead." They reached a large metal door, secured with a biometric lock. Victor approached a control panel, using a small device he had brought to override the system. The door slid open with a low hum, revealing a massive room filled with screens and servers, the nerve center of the operation. A man stood in the center, his back turned to them. He was tall, with graying hair and an air of authority that was immediately evident. He turned slowly, his expression one of surprise that quickly gave way to cold amusement. "James Harrison," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I must say, I didn't expect you to make it this far." James stepped forward, his eyes blazing with fury. "It ends here," he said simply. "No more children, no more suffering." The man laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the room. "Do you really think it's that simple?" he asked. "You can shut down this place, but the network is bigger than you know.
It won't stop.
Mariah's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. We're not here to stop everything, she said. Just you. The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold rage. You're too late, he sneered. Even if you destroy this facility, others will take my place. It's a never-ending cycle. Victor's voice was low, but filled with a dangerous calm. Then let's break it, starting with you. Before the man could react, James lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled, their movements violent and desperate. Mariah watched with a mix of fear and determination, her weapon trained on the man in case he managed to overpower James. But James' rage was too great. He landed a series of brutal punches, each one fueled by years of pain and frustration. Where is the data? James demanded, his voice raw. Where are the records of the children? The man gasped, blood trickling from his mouth. You'll never find it, he spat. It's encrypted, hidden away in places you can't reach. Mariah stepped forward, her eyes cold. We don't need to find it, she said. We just need to destroy it. With a swift motion, Victor inserted a small device into one of the main servers. This will wipe everything, he explained. All their files, their communications, their records. It'll set them back years. The man's eyes widened in horror. No, he shouted, trying to rise. But James held him down. It's over, James said firmly, his voice filled with finality. The screens flickered as the virus began its work, wiping out years of data in a matter of minutes. Alarms blared throughout the mansion, signaling the end of an era of darkness and corruption. But their victory was short-lived. Suddenly, armed guards stormed into the room, guns raised and ready to fire. James, Mariah, and Victor braced themselves, knowing this could be the end. Then, a voice crackled over the intercom. Stand down, it commanded. The guards hesitated, then slowly lowered their weapons. It was over. The operation was officially dismantled. The three of them made their way out of the mansion, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of peace, however fragile. He looked at Mariah, a silent understanding passing between them. We did it, she said softly, her eyes filled with tears. James nodded, his own eyes wet with emotion. We did, he agreed. As they reached the front gate, Victor stopped, his expression serious. This is where I leave you, he said quietly. James looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and lingering mistrust. Why now? He asked. Victor sighed, his eyes filled with regret. Because I need to find my own redemption, he said. But thank you for giving me a chance to make things right. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. James and Mariah returned to the safe house, where Emily waited anxiously. The moment she saw them, she ran forward, her face breaking into a wide smile. Dad, Mariah. James knelt down, pulling her into a tight hug. It's over, he said softly. We're safe now. Emily's eyes were filled with tears of relief. I knew you'd come back, she said, her voice filled with a childlike faith that had somehow survived everything. Mariah watched them, her heart full. We have a lot to rebuild, she said, her voice filled with hope. But we'll do it together. As the sun began to rise, the darkness that had haunted them for so long finally started to lift. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it was filled with the promise of a better tomorrow. For Emily, for James, and for Mariah, it was the beginning of a new life. One born not from fear, but from courage, resilience, and the power of love that had never truly died.